It's hard to know when the right time is to start on a reaction video to what we've actually gotten in Legion. There's just so much content to go through that I'm not sure when I'll be able to rightly say I've seen enough and can properly react to it. But since I've done most of the storyline quests in the 5 zones, I think I've seen enough to be able to get some thoughts out there. The fact is, the content is going to keep coming in Legion, and if it doesn't, we'll have a whole different problem. So I'm expecting to make a series of videos like this one to react to what we are and aren't seeing in Legion as we go through the expansion. I'm planning on doing a video about the 5 zones pretty soon, but I'm still going to do more videos as patches come out. I'd like to go over some of the things that I was concerned about, and I'd like to start out with professions, particularly engineering. At least for engineering, progression in Legion is expensive. Or at least getting all the really cool gadgets built requires huge amounts of regents that it takes days or even weeks to farm. But the reward is there, and working hard to get it makes the reward sweeter. Plus, it gets easier as you go, which makes sense from a lore perspective, as you get upgraded recipes that require fewer regions to make. I got quite a bit of mileage out of maxing out the gunpowder charge recipe. It still feels weird that I'm buying regions instead of making them myself, but so far the fact that I'm buying this stuff adds up in terms of the story. The engineer I'm buying them from expected to be able to sell lots of guns that he'd crafted, but then every hunter got Titan Strike, the Eagle Spear, or a legendary bow, and he needs to figure out what to do with his guns. Most of the recipes you see are him and Flintlock improvising solutions with the materials he has on hand. That's engineering for you. Actually, that alone adds some pretty good flavor to the engineering profession, and the storylines actually make progression more interesting and fun. It is way better than daily craftables that both unlock recipes and provide the items you need to do the actual crafting. As for Obliterum, I've unlocked the Obliterum Forge, but I've not yet unlocked the ability to make purple level items that could be destroyed in it, so I've not yet had a chance to really see how useful Obliterum feels. We shall see how that goes. Since crafting items take so stinking much material, I'm kind of guessing that it'll end up being much more efficient to go into heroics or looking for raid to get your hands on decent gear than it will be to build up Obliterum, in which case the Obliterum Forge might as well not even be in the game. But we'll see whether that's actually what happens or not. On that note, probably I've had more incentive than ever to try joining a guild. I can't make the purple level engineering goggles unless I run a mythic dungeon, and since you can't queue for mythic content, I'm pretty much going to need to be in a guild in order to get that recipe. That's got its negative aspects, but one of the things that the game has been missing since vanilla has been recipes that you get because you go into a dungeon or raid. The Force Reactive Disc and Core Marksman Rifle were both recipes for engineering that dropped from Molten Core back in vanilla, and they were incentives to go into that raid. By the same token, this is incentivizing me to get in a guild, team up with other players, and this is something that WoW has distinctly lacked in Warlords of Draenor. Another good thing about having all these quests for professions in Legion is that it'll be easy for Blizzard to tack on additional materials to gathering. I got chunks of ore that I could take back to my mining trainer in Dalaran when I first got a rich deposit, or when I first mined from a basilisk corpse, or the first time I found a seam of laystone or fellslate. If Blizzard wanted to take my hot, cold, crackling, flowing moat idea for future development, and I still hope that they will, then they could easily add a quest to the mining trainer that would allow you to mine elemental regents out of mining nodes. So far, the lack of variety in regents hasn't been that huge a deal, because the progression makes sense in story, and the progression, while expensive, is rewarding. But adding in new regents to make better, newer, and more varied craftables would be a good idea, and it would make progression through the expansion seem more real and flavorful. So I'm still hoping that they add varieties of elemental regents to the game as Legion goes on. There's definitely room for it and potential for it to improve the game. I'd also love it if Blizzard went the whole 9 yards and made a real, flavorful dichotomy between Goblin and Gnomish engineering again, with Goblins having more and better bombs while Gnomes have more varied and fun gadgets. But Blizzard doesn't really seem to put much stock in that dichotomy, and hasn't since midway through the Burning Crusade, so I'm not really likely to see that. Historically, they've just thrown a lot of recipes at the players at launch and then mostly stopped caring about professions after that until the next expansion. But hopefully Warlords of Draenor's break from that is a sign Blizzard wants to expand on professions mid-expansion. I think Blizzard's attempt in patch 6.2 fell flat on its face, but who knows? Blizzard might do something right this time around. As for the worries I had about the Holy Paladin spec, I have to admit that the loss of Denounce isn't as bad for gameplay as I was expecting it to be, not even close. In fact, most of the time while I'm soloing, I don't even miss it. Most of the time. Once in a while, a ranged ability with no cooldown would be nice, but since I have instant damage abilities and I almost always have at least one ready to fire, it's actually engaging. More so than Denounce spam would have been. Even with that being said, I still think a Cataclysm-style Exorcism would be good for flavor, the proc could shake up our rotation and make it more fun, and the occasional situations where I wish I had a ranged damage spell with no cooldown would find this helpful. The only other change I'm hoping for or expecting with the Holy Paladin spec is the addition of an AoE heal with no cooldown. So far in what 5-man content I've done, group healing hasn't been an issue, and for a casual like me it's downright probable that group healing will never be a huge issue. But from what I've heard about mythic content, the group damage is insane, and if Holy Paladins don't have an AoE heal with no cooldown, they won't have the tools in their kits to actually deal with all that group damage. We need the tools to succeed in our kits if they want us to succeed, so change probably needs to happen there. One concern that I still have for another spec, there's no AoE damage for Disciplined Priests. As a Holy Paladin in Mists and Warlords, I know what it's like to lack multi-target damage tools, so I feel you guys' pain. Honestly, why did Blizzard do this to a spec that's meant to be a hybrid damage and healing spec? Speaking of Warlords, one of what I consider to be two major issues with Warlords was the fact that garrisons got old and boring fast. Garrisons were the thing Blizzard was banking on to keep players engaged, and they weren't. They felt like it got old and boring. Blizzard's new idea for keeping players engaged and keeping them logging in seems to be world quests. My experience with them is that they're essentially repackaged dailies, albeit with a lot of conveniences thrown in. They are what you do if you want to grind reputation, but now you don't need to go to the quest giver at a town in order to pick the quests up or to turn them in after you're done. Just fly to a nearby town, charge in, kill the mobs, and then you're done. They seem to be shorter than the dailies I did back in Mists of Pandaria, and if you complete 4 of them for a given faction in one day, you'll get some extra rewards. To be honest, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of variety in these world quests. It's like there's only a dozen of them or so per faction. The ones that I see do connect well with the stories that you play through in the 5 zones. I'll get more into those stories when I do my review of the zones. But the lack of variety means these really aren't going to keep players engaged for very long. They will get old and boring, probably even faster than dailies and mists or garrisons and warlords. If Blizzard wants to keep players engaged, then unfortunately they're going to have to do a really expensive thing from their development standpoint and keep the content coming. New raids, new dungeons, new quests need to keep coming, or else players will get bored and the awesomeness of 7.0 will leave in a rush. On the subject of garrisons, class order halls seem to me to be a lot like garrisons, only less. That's obviously the direction they want to go in. There are far fewer champions than you had followers, there are far fewer missions in class order halls than there were in garrisons, and you won't be able to complete missions at the rate you could in garrisons. Then again, just like garrisons, the decisions you make have effects on your playstyle in the world, though there are fewer of those decisions to be made. I completed the Paladin class order hall campaign, and it felt like it was short and wasn't all that satisfying at the end. However, there was one part that was everything I've been asking for. There was a segment where I went into a Legion world and rescued a bunch of my knights from my order hall, including Apony Brightmane and a few other followers. The way I rescued my knights really took the cake. I had to use my class's abilities on them for it to work. Some of them had diseases that I had to cleanse off, some of them were dead and I had to resurrect them, some of them were shackled and I had to cast Blessing of Freedom on them to get them loose. None of that kill a guard, take a key, and free the NPC cliche stuff. I'm actually using my class skills to progress in the quest. That adds a lot of class identity and gives me a good feel for my class's place in the world. This is just what I'd wanted. Unfortunately, the final showdown of the Paladin class order hall campaign wasn't up to par with the rest of the quality of the expansion. I went to the Priest Order Hall, which I got a lot of footage up because I knew this could be the only time I'd get to see it as a Paladin, and I helped the Priest Order Hall fight off a Legion invasion. This saved Velen, who had an excellent chunk of story much earlier in the campaign that I don't want to spoil here. There was also an excellent main antagonist in Balnazar. He has a history going back to Warcraft 3. He corrupted the Scarlet Crusade as far back as vanilla, and as such, he was a terrific choice for a main antagonist. However, the fight against him wasn't challenging at all. A different NPC tanked him, and I wasn't called on to use any class abilities during the fight. There could have been shackling debuffs on the tank NPC that I had to use Blessing of Freedom to take off. There could have been sleep clouds that poison allies that I need to cleanse off. Heck, there could have even at least been waves of carrion swarm bats that I need to avoid as encounter mechanics. But no, none of that happened. Secondly, remember the storyline with Velen that I made a point not to spoil? I still won't spoil it, but none of that story was alluded to in the finale at all. And it was almost like all that stuff that happened to Velen earlier didn't happen. That is not a good thing, believe me. The things that happened to Velen were incredibly important and could even shape the expansion as it goes on, or maybe even shape the next expansion. They should have somehow played a part, or at least been mentioned while I was protecting Velen in the Priest Order Hall. But no. That was a disappointment, and just a little more effort in those areas on Blizzard's part could have fixed it. What's really disappointing about that? The most controversial move Blizzard has made in Legion is turning the player character into a Warcraft character. Now, it's possible that it'll actually work out for the best. Giving the player a big, grand title like High Lord or Cardinal and making them the leader of a whole class order and just handing the player a massive artifact weapon may seem a little off. But if Blizzard manages to make good stories out of it, it'll actually be a good move. If it happens, it'll be a story that will unfold as the expansion progresses. However, they need to do an excellent job with those stories in order for it to feel like we really are Warcraft characters. Parts of the story so far they've gotten right, while other parts they haven't quite done so well on. Also, all of this "it could work" talk is assuming we don't have another content letdown like we did in Warlords. If we do, Blizzard needs to start planning Warcraft 4. There are a couple of things that scare me about the story going forward, though. The current story thread for Legion is that we need to get our hands on 5 Titan artifacts, the Pillars of Creation, in order to seal a massive portal that's allowing the Legion to bring a ton of their forces into Azeroth. But the quest lines of the 4 leveling zones already gave us 4 of those pillars, and once we kill Gul'dan in Nighthold, we'll have the 5th one. Doesn't that kind of mean that the expansion story will be done once we get those? Blizzard's going to need to be careful about how they handle this. This actually reminds me of how, back in Warlords, one of the opening shots in a cutscene during your first quests in Draenor shows the 5 bigwigs of the Iron Horde. But players killed these guys off at a surprising rate. Ner'zhul died in a 5-man. I still think it was a horrible sin that he didn't get his own raid since he's the Lich King, but I've already discussed that. Bladefist died in the first raid, Blackhand died in the second raid. It was too many items on that checklist that got checked off too soon. I don't want a repeat of that in Legion. Then again, Blizzard has left a lot of plot threads hanging that could be picked up later. Who knows what happened to Jaina? Who knows what's going to happen to Velen? And there's no telling what the demons who've already come through those portals may be up to. Those Pillars of Creation could end up getting stolen at any time or used or corrupted in ways we can't anticipate. And who knows where Rathian is? He was a huge player in Mists. We should have seen more of him in Warlords and didn't. That's a whole separate issue. And who knows what Azshara might be up to? It's not like she died after the Azuna quests. So Blizzard has a lot of options open to them about how this expansion could go forward. So we'll just have to see what the next chapter of the story holds. I know I'm on the edge of my seat.